Yes, and as a local resident, but also a migrant, I also want to acknowledge the country and indigenous land I'm working and living and standing on. As Pip said, my area of expertise is in, I'm an academic, and James Curran was going to be here to be a fellow academic, and unfortunately he's not going to be here. So my areas of expertise is media anthropology. So, and for the last several years, I spent quite a bit of time researching on trying to answer this question. That is how the Australian media, our mainstream media, shapes the public opinion on foreign policy issues, especially on China and the China-related issues or Chinese-Australian communities issues. So I'm coming to this debate from a somewhat different angle, but I believe that it's an angle that's very often forgotten or neglected, and so hopefully it's useful. Today I would like to share four points, depends on the time I have, and although they may not all agree with everyone, I am confident that at least each of them is actually drawing on the evidence-based research that I've been doing. And I'm happy to share statistics and data that I have presented to you later on if you want to. First of all, the first point I want to make is that our mainstream media's coverage of China and the China policy has provided plenty of evidence that our media, including the ABC, has really failed to function as a watchdog, and instead has become a guard dog. And what do I mean by that? That is, they're happy to play the role as a guard dog for our security, intelligence, and defense. So our media's coverage of AUKUS provides a very good case in point for the point I'm making. What I meant by that is that instead of asking questions about the vested interest, political, economic, and institutional interests that are invested in the decision behind AUKUS, or indeed behind our policy about China per se, our media, in fact, works hand in glove with this establishment. So that's what I meant by changing the sort of model from the guard dog, watchdog to the guard dog. Don't get me wrong, in the covering of the domestic issues, our media's watchdog instinct is live and well. But whenever it comes to China, there is a switch. And so what we see is what we call the emergence of a academic / media / military / industrial complex, a long word with a lot of hyphens. But this complex is the hallmark of Cold War, right? If you look at the history of Cold War era, this complex is important for the Cold War to function. So that's the first point I want to make. The second one is AUKUS. The fact that the AUKUS has been met with, until now, has been met with very little pushback from the public. That's what you meant by shoving down the throat. Until now. Why? It is because our media has sufficiently primed the public to be anxious and fearful of a China threat. If James was sitting here, he would have told you, and now I have to quote him, and he wrote in a recent article in the Foreign Affairs Journal that the China threat narrative has hardened into a dogma, right? So, and this narrative has become the overarching framework within which everything about China-related issues is talked about, right? So in the words of an Australian Chinese journalist that I had a long conversation with yesterday, she works for a mainstream media establishment as an Australian Chinese journalist, and she was sharing her grievance with me about what it's like to be working in an institution like that. She said, just consider China threat is the source. Everything to do with China has to be dipped into that sauce before it serves on the plate. I thought, was it tomato sauce or soy sauce? It must be soy sauce because it's Chinese.
Soy.
Vinegar, no, very acerbic, you mean? Yeah. Good one. So on to the third point. So the warmongering that Marcus was referring to. To push AUKUS involves warmongering, right? Everybody's, probably most people remember the Sydney Morning Herald's red alert, right? Because we some of us had the date of invasion on the war. It's passed. But now Mark Pazzullo just only last week told us it's only 17 months ahead before that happens. So they're having this kind of game to see who can be more accurate with the prediction of when China is going to invade us. So this, of course, has caused a lot of anxiety on the part of the Australian public, but much more so on the part of the Chinese Australians. Not for the same reason. They are pretty sure that actually China is not going to invade Australia. But they're really worried for a number of reasons. One is that they know firsthand that all this warmongering about China is going to and has translated into anti-Chinese racism on the grounds, on the buses, on the trains, in workplaces, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they're worried about the fact that all this talk about war can become some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you talk about it, the more tension that you create, right? But the most important reason that's shared by some people, but not, but is actually quite an insignificant not an insignificant kind of minority, is that they ask the question, what's going to happen if eventually Australia does have a war with China? The question they ask is chilling, but it's actually quite understandable. Are we going to be interned? Because they know enough about history, about how the Italians and how the Germans and the Japanese were interned, right? And they even know that we are a multicultural society and all that. When the war really happens, who is going to guarantee, right? So they're worried about that. So there's a lot of anxiety. Final point I want to make is that the framework of the China threats led to also, apart from the worrying, but also has led to a widespread distrust and suspicion over the political loyalty and allegiance of the Chinese communities. I'll just give you a data point. For 3 years in a row, my institute, which is Australian-China Relations Institute at UTS, has come up with polls that suggest that 4 in 10 Australians surveyed believe that the Chinese Australians can be mobilized by the Chinese Communist Party to act against Australia. Still, they can, even last year, 4 in 10. So Labour has done much better at managing the rhetoric, right? As a result of that, they have to some extent won the approval of the Chinese community, Chinese Australian communities, which is why the Chinese communities in this time, in the last election, have voted overwhelmingly in support of Labour. But not because of AUKUS, but precisely in spite of AUKUS. Because I have data to show that the majority of the Chinese Australians do not support AUKUS, right? And some of them are quite interested. This is the message I want to leave with you. Some of them are quite interested in working with the so-called mainstream peace groups and the activists to forge collaborations and solidarities. So I think it's good that I see some Chinese faces here, but not enough. And because they're worried about how they're going to be seen, and they're worried about being engaged. So I think it would be useful for us to kind of do some thinking about how to, I think for the educated, middle class, progressive people who live in a city, they can be quite progressive on a whole range of social issues. But it seems when it comes to China, there is still the tendency to be quite prone to fall into the traps of our mainstream media. Because I think that a lot of people on the left simply do not know how to position themselves in relation to China. Are they an authoritarian regime? Yes, it is. And don't they have a really oppressive political system? Yes, they do. But that's not the same thing as whether they're going to invade us or not, right? So let's just become a little bit more nuanced in talking about China, because unless we do, we continue to have this shaft down our throat. Thank you. I'll stop there.